A continuación, de Venture Studio a Fondo de VC, el viaje latinoamericano de Polymath. A continuación, Wendy Kai de Polymath Ventures. Un fuerte aplauso.
Buenos días a todos. All right, so my talk is going to be about my journey here in Latin America building for the middle class and why we are now launching a venture capital firm. So usually, the two questions I get asked is why LATAM and why did you build a venture studio? Especially since when we started in 2012, there was the term venture studio, the concept of company building was quite undefined. Actually, I think that the most important question is not those two, but actually why build at all? So I believe that every great entrepreneur should have a problem that they really want to solve. And for me, that problem happens to be about the middle income trap. And for better or worse, Latin America is kind of the poster child for that problem. And I think that those types of problems for an entrepreneur are the ones where they feel they can't leave this earth without trying their very best to solve. So for me, I think that if you look at, it's not too hard to understand why this problem is so interesting and important. If you look at the left-hand graph here, Latin America is the most unequal market in the world, and the growth has really stagnated. And so if you look at the left-hand side, this is GDP per capita, and you see that Latin America actually became middle incomes in the population, at least on an average, much earlier than other benchmark countries. So these are other middle income countries like China, Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so forth. And so Latin America arrived much earlier at that middle income status, but over the last 15 years has kind of regressed a bit and been surpassed by mostly these other Asian countries. And this is obviously very problematic. And I think the right-hand graph really talks about why this is happening and why it's so problematic, right? Because if you look at what the components of growth really mean is like the growth that happened, who did it benefit, or how did that growth happen? So of course, some of it is just population growth, which is the green part of the graph, and Latin America has actually seen more population growth than Asia, for example, in this time period of like workers. But if you see what's in blue, that is the change to wages. So very little of the growth that happened for Latin America actually went to wage increases for the workers. The vast majority of it went to profits, which is like income to owners of businesses, and taxes, which is like income to the government, right? So this is partly a very clear explanation of why that per capita GDP has actually stayed pretty stagnant or even regressed a little bit. And I think all of this speaks to some of the structural issues in the economy, which are about, a lot of informality, a lot of inequality, a lot of like very concentrated market dynamics in terms of the important industries controlled by very few players, so there's not a lot of competition and so forth. And so this is, given that this is the problem I, as an entrepreneur, was the most passionate about solving, and I had a clear hypothesis, but it was a hypothesis that needed to be proven out, right? So the hypothesis, given my experience building and exiting a tech startup in Silicon Valley, is that we could take a lot of the technology and take some of those Silicon Valley toolkits around VC funding or equity incentivized packages for employees. These things could be really game changers to building a powerful, scalable solution for a lot of this, like what the middle class needed in terms of jobs, in terms of better employment, better income opportunities, better products and services. And so that was the hypothesis. But it needed to be validated, and also what were the exact solutions that was going to solve this problem, right? So for me, I couldn't think of a better way than actually to go and test by building these types of companies and trying to solve, the range of issues, probably too ambitious, but that's why the venture studio, and that's why we started with building rather than investing. I think the other piece of the problem that was clear from the beginning, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to solve it, and I think being at least partially successful in solving it, is the talent problem. So the real question was not that whether Latin America had enough talent, but was there enough motivated talent given the inequality that existed, right? The fact that people who were probably educated enough to solve these problems were probably not from the emerging middle class. Were there going to be enough people motivated to build these types of businesses and had the skill to do so? So that was another clear set of issues that needed to get solved for all of this to come together. So, what have we done? I think that there's been good success and good archetypes of startups that we really built around solving the middle class, the middle class, emerging middle class needs, and so very laser focused on that mission, but really are scalable, profitable businesses. And so we've raised, $70 million, a lot of that in the last few years. And so there's been some decent scale up of our companies, and more importantly, related to the original issue, right, the problem of the middle class, it was, I think we found at least 3 pretty relevant archetypes of startups that can both address the issues, but also end up raising VC capital and scaling and so forth. And those archetypes I have here, and these are the companies listed here are kind of like the more mature companies in our portfolio. So one is around e-commerce, and Elena's is a very good example, which is Elena's is a social selling platform. It's basically modernizing and digitizing the very common behavior of direct sales in Latin America, usually through women. And because of the innovation in the business model, Elena's sellers are selling on average 5 times as much as in traditional direct sales. That means usually 5 times as much income from selling because it's easier to sell, they can sell to more people through mobile, and they don't have to have any capital requirements to be able to sell. If you look at fintech, clearly access to financing or access to loans is a big barrier to the productivity of single proprietor, micro, small businesses. And aflote through a network of what we call consejeros, so these advisors in the community, we've been able to actually increase the productivity of giving out microfinance loans at 5 times with half of the risk, right? So I think there's been these types of models that are very focused on the right channels to access the population, very mobile-driven, and so forth, I think have been powerful, not only in the development of the right products in financial services, but how do you get that product out to this population at a cost-effective way. And then the third category is I think, a little bit closer to, I have here service marketplace, but actually I would say, in the US these days is probably more termed as vertical marketplaces. So, verticalized SaaS. So Latin America is full of these humongous, super fragmented, pretty informal service industries. Auto repair is a very good example of that. So there's 750,000 auto repair shops around the continent. And what these models do is we essentially give a full suite of software as a service, procurement, and then access to clients. And so that really changes the productivity of these small and often informal businesses. So a shop with AutoLab makes 7 times the profit versus before. So these businesses and these business models, and I think more importantly, these business model archetypes have really gotten, I think have really been great demonstrations of how much income and productivity gains can come from intentionally designing for the demographic, right? So what what has been learned over the years? So there's been a lot of learning, a lot of pain, a lot of growth, good successes as well. And I wanted to share 3 learnings and kind of how that takes us then towards the capital world. So I think the first learning is that building VC-funded companies is the most viable, although imperfect, path to build scalable solutions to the emerging middle class. Right? So we've done a lot of tests, and in the beginning, there wasn't a lot of VC capital, so we raised from everybody that you can imagine, and I think this is where we ended up. And the reasons are, I think, particularly these like full tech models, they happen to be both the right way to serve this like very fragmented, very informal economy that the middle class and emerging middle class happen to live in Latin America, but they're also basically like, in my opinion at least, the only way to get to a 10x better product that really then competes strongly with incumbents, right? I think the second piece is that building these types of companies takes like tens of millions of dollars. They're not cheap. Like technology is expensive to build, good product takes time to build, and at the end of the day, VCs understand how to write the risk of these early stage companies, at least in my experience, better than impact investors, PEs, and corporates. And so even if the VC is not mission or impact oriented, they're still kind of the right people and candidates to underwrite these businesses. Now, the problem, not the problem, but one of the downsides, one of the imperfections about this is, at least in Latin America, there's not a lot of R&D capital. There's not a lot of capital willing to go in and help, underwrite that stage where you are figuring out the innovative business model. And so what that bias is, because that can take like that, not necessarily in a span of months, it could be a span of years that you're really iterating and tinkering. And so the problem is that then that biases the entire ecosystem towards more copycat models, because it's much easier to raise money on models that you can point to. And so the problem is, when you build for this demographic, it's much, the likelihood that you'll have to tweak the model quite a bit because of the income, because of the channels to reach the customers and everything is pretty high. So I think this is one of the issues still in the VC industry in the region. We've found a bit of a hack on this because we've seen more comparables in Asia, in China, and India, for example. And so at least we can say, like, there's a similar model here, and they've scaled because usually those ecosystems are a few years ahead. And we've actually been able to even bring some of those investors to invest in our company. So that's a little bit of a hack. I think that's the first learning. The second one is around the talent side. So I think in an emerging ecosystem such as LATAM, the talent gap is actually like pretty multidimensional. And so my view is that these formulaic solutions on talent are really quite narrow, right? So I'm a big I'm in high level agreement with some of these like principles, like the strength of founding CEOs really are non-negotiable in order for the success of a startup. But I think some of the kind of fervent that I see in Latin America following Silicon Valley, like truisms on talent, in my opinion, is a little bit misguided, right? Because the talent ecosystem is super different. At the end, the number of experienced talent, that talent pool is still pretty shallow. My point here is not about potential, but it is about experience, right? And so inherently, there's many talent gaps that need to be solved in a creative way, in a very like kind of design-focused, intentional way. And we look at those talent gaps and problems as something that we can go and almost like find product market fit for. Like, what's the gap? How do we find the solution? And we do that quite intentionally. So to give a few examples, we we found that a combination of international and local founders actually creates pretty strong teams. We found that when there's like very senior digital talent missing, that we can sometimes bring like a very senior engineer from Europe and then very intentionally build a group of like a little bit more junior talent locally around that, so there's an incredible learning experience for everyone. And that has worked really well. I think talent is so important for startups that we often, we've found certain archetypes of people who are not necessarily from HR that end up becoming great talent managers. They're like process engineers or like sales managers that end up becoming great HR talent managers for us. So we've gone in and really solved these problems one by one. And I think the last really important lesson, and then it kind of leads very naturally into why we're going towards VC, is capital is like a problem all onto itself, right? Like capital is not a derivative problem of building, but the issue is, I don't know if it's a but my observation is that there's a real tension between the logic of building and the logic of capital. Like these things, I don't think it can be fully solved, right? And what is that tension? So I think building is inherently about problem solving, right? You have like a range of founders that are a little bit more opportunistic, a little bit more problem solving oriented. But at the end of the day, if you look at the cycle length of what it takes to build a great company, which in my opinion is like a 10-year span, problem solving always wins. Right? So I think, whereas capital is inherently like kind of opportunistic, right? It's by definition, so you need to find the right time to invest in something, the right trade-offs between risk, reward, and especially in Latin America, capital has a lot of options, right? So I think, how do you really bridge this logic of building and the logic of capital? It becomes a very important problem to solve. And the problem actually changes. Like that bridge at the seed, at the A, at the B, at the growth stage is really, really different, right? And so they're almost distinct problems unto themselves. So I think that, and by the way, maybe one like side note here is, there obviously is a correction in VC going on globally. It's happening in LATAM as well. None of us are enjoying it, right? But I think one of the silver linings here is I actually think that the LATAM ecosystem got a little bit too many founders that were actually more capital-oriented than problem-solving or builder-oriented. And I think this correction is going to be interesting to right-size that a little bit. So for us, we're launching a seed fund, and I think this is the culmination of saying, okay, in terms of figuring out what types of problems actually solve for the emerging middle class, we're probably like 75% of the way through understanding that problem. In terms of solving the talent problem, maybe we're 50% of the way in solving that problem. But the capital problem, despite raising like $70 million, is still, maybe we're like 25% of the way in solving that problem. So I'm very interested, and as a company, as Polymath, we're very interested in and motivated to really figure out the bridge between this logic of building and the logic of capital. And I think that we're bringing a lot of builder experience, 30 people on the operating team that have operating experience. So it's really a entrepreneur to entrepreneur type of interaction, which I think is really valuable as the ecosystem matures, and we build more and more meaningful companies that are transformative for the region. And that's it. Thank you so much.